Chapter 1: The Neighborhood Under Siege. The neighborhood had once been a quiet, predictable place where residents lived in a rhythm that rarely changed. People left for work at the same hour every morning, returned in the evening, and spent weekends mowing lawns or taking slow walks with their dogs. The streets were clean, the homes were neatly lined up, and the occasional dispute was usually settled with a friendly chat over a fence. At least that was how things used to be, before Karen decided she had discovered her life's grand purpose: enforcing parking rules that didn't actually exist. It started quietly at first, barely enough for anyone to take notice. A single car disappeared one morning from a neighbor's driveway, leaving behind a confused owner who assumed it had been stolen. Then another vanished 2 days later. People whispered, posted in the community group chat, and wondered whether some new wave of thieves had targeted their peaceful street. Parents grew worried, homeowners became cautious, and everyone went to bed with uneasy glances toward windows. But the truth wasn't criminal. It was far pettier. Karen, the woman who lived in the beige 2-story home at the entrance of the neighborhood, had taken it upon herself to restore order. She had always been the type who hovered at her window, monitoring which neighbor allowed their trash cans to sit out an hour too long, or which teenager parked slightly crooked. She memorized everyone's schedules, routines, and habits as though preparing for an exam only she could ever take. But when a new tow truck company expanded its service area to include their suburb, something inside her snapped into high gear, convinced this was her moment to shine. Soon, tow trucks became such a regular sight that residents joked the drivers probably knew the street better than the mailman. Yet nobody was laughing when their cars were taken from their own property. Karen had figured out a loophole. She could call the company anonymously and claim a vehicle was obstructing emergency access, and the tow drivers, eager for business, didn't question it. They swooped in, hooked up a car within minutes, and disappeared before anyone realized what was happening. Within a week, 5 households had been forced to pay hundreds of dollars in towing and storage fees. People gathered in driveways, piecing together clues. One homeowner noticed a pattern. Every tow truck arrived from the same direction, drove the same path, and seemed to turn back toward Karen's house before leaving. Another neighbor added that Karen had been seen pacing outside just before each tow, phone in hand, pretending to water her plants or pull imaginary weeds from her pristine flower beds. Gradually, whispers turned into suspicions, suspicions turned into certainty, and certainty ignited anger. The community had always tolerated Karen's constant complaints, passive-aggressive letters, and bizarre rule interpretations. Most people simply rolled their eyes and continued living their lives. But this time, she had gone too far. She was costing families money, wrecking routines, and creating distrust among neighbors. What she viewed as a heroic crusade was in reality tearing apart the peace everyone else valued. Still, confronting her wasn't easy. Karen had a reputation for escalating even the smallest disagreement. People avoided crossing her path, afraid she would file reports for anything she could twist into a violation. A few braver homeowners debated marching to her front door together, but cooler minds advised caution. Instead, they began documenting every tow she orchestrated, gathering timestamps, photos, and messages that pointed to one source. During one late evening meeting at a neighbor's garage, what had become unofficially their crime committee, someone noticed a small detail that changed everything. When mapping out every incident, they realized Karen's own driveway layout seemed off. Something about its angle and length didn't match the city's approved code template. At first, it seemed unimportant, but the more they checked, the stranger it appeared. A retired architect in the neighborhood pulled out his old measuring tools, walked past Karen's house the next morning under the guise of a casual stroll, and discreetly paced from the sidewalk to the end of her driveway. He returned with raised eyebrows. The driveway extended farther into the sidewalk easement than legally allowed. It was a structural violation, one that could result in fines, penalties, or even mandatory reconstruction. It was almost funny in its irony. The self-appointed parking enforcer, the woman who had tormented her neighbors with pointless rules and imagined restrictions, was breaking an actual city code that came with real consequences. But rather than react impulsively, the neighbors continued gathering evidence. They wanted everything in order before taking action, something airtight, undeniable, and powerful enough to end her reign of petty tyranny. The more they observed, the clearer the picture became. Karen's remodeling project from 3 years ago had extended her driveway without properly filing the required permit. She had hired a cheap contractor who completed the job in a single afternoon, and she had assumed no one would ever notice. But years later, her own attempt to control the neighborhood had exposed the one flaw she had hoped would stay hidden forever. Meanwhile, the towing chaos continued. Residents lived in fear of stepping outside to find another empty space where their car used to be. Parents were late picking up their kids, workers missed shifts, delivery drivers refused to stop anywhere near the street. Frustration built until the tension was nearly unbearable, and the community reached a collective breaking point. Something had to be done. And now, with new information about her driveway in hand, the neighbors finally had their opportunity. Not just to stop Karen, but to make sure she never disrupted their lives again. As the community gathered once more, this time with a clear plan forming, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't fear anymore, it was resolve. Karen had turned their peaceful neighborhood into a battleground, but she had also given them the weapon they needed to restore order. The next steps would require careful execution, but they were ready. And the moment they decided to take action, the story of the woman who weaponized towing against her own neighbors began moving toward an ending she never saw coming. Chapter 2. The plan takes shape. The community's frustration had matured into strategy. What began as scattered complaints had now become a coordinated effort, and each neighbor contributed something essential. Some gathered photographic proof of the tow trucks arriving minutes after Karen stepped outside. Others collected receipts, timestamps, and statements. A few even monitored her daily routine, noting the moments she walked briskly to the curb with her phone raised, pretending to inspect something harmless. But the centerpiece of their plan was the driveway violation. The architect had verified more measurements, and another neighbor pulled up archived city blueprints. The difference was undeniable. Karen's driveway was illegally extended, just enough to encroach on the city right-of-way. And for years, nobody had questioned it, until she forced everyone to question everything. The neighbors crafted a meticulous pocket of evidence, organized in a binder thicker than anything Karen had ever filed against them. Photos of tows, maps of the driveway, records of her past complaints, documentation of the impact her behavior had caused, time lost, money wasted, safety hazards created. Every piece told the same story. A resident who had taken her obsession far beyond neighborly concern. The final step was to bring the matter formally to the city inspector. They scheduled an appointment, knowing Karen wouldn't expect it. And when the day came, the community waited quietly as the inspector approached her home with official authority and a calm, unreadable expression. The door opened. Karen stepped outside, wearing her usual confidence, unaware of the storm behind it. When the inspector began asking about permits, dates, and construction details, the shift in her expression was unmistakable. Panic flickered behind her eyes. The neighbors watched from a distance, not with spite, but with the quiet satisfaction of justice finally catching up with the very person who had made their lives chaotic. As the inspector took more measurements, jotting down notes that would eventually turn into formal citations, the residents realized the tide had finally turned. The break in Karen's confidence marked a new phase, one where she could no longer hide behind anonymous calls or petty interpretations of non-existent rules. And the neighborhood prepared for the aftermath they knew was coming.
Chapter 3. The investigation deepens. The first inspection was only the beginning. The city's follow-up process required additional visits, photos, and clarification. Karen attempted to stall, to argue, and to redirect blame, but none of her usual tactics swayed official protocol. The inspector remained unmoved, working by the book, while noting every discrepancy. As the investigation expanded, other issues emerged. The city discovered that Karen's construction not only violated code, but had been filed under a permit type that didn't match the actual work completed. The contractor she hired had never submitted final documentation. Her driveway violated setback requirements, and the encroachment onto public property raised concerns about liability, especially in the case of emergency access. For a woman who weaponized rules, discovering she had broken several of them was a heavy blow. The neighborhood observed this all unfold with quiet fascination. Cars were finally safe again. The tow trucks had stopped visiting entirely. Karen didn't dare make calls while inspectors were monitoring her property. Residents began parking in front of their homes with renewed confidence, no longer casting nervous glances toward the entrance of the street. But even with the community feeling relief, Karen's behavior grew restless. She paced outside more frequently, talking on her phone with frantic energy. She dug through old paperwork, searching for anything that might help her case. She even attempted to regain control by issuing new complaints to the HOA, none of which were taken seriously anymore. Her influence had evaporated. Her authority was gone, and the neighborhood was no longer afraid. The inspector returned one final time with a thick envelope in hand. Whatever was inside determined what Karen would face next. The neighbors didn't know the exact penalties yet, but they sensed something major was coming. Karen's storm was no longer theirs to weather. It was finally her own. Chapter 5. Tow Truck Karma Arrives. Ironically, the very company Karen had used against her neighbors now became the final trigger of her downfall. To prevent violations during the reconstruction, Karen needed to move her car completely off the driveway. She attempted to park it partially on the street, but the crew informed her it still obstructed their equipment. Frustrated, she drove it farther up the curb, inadvertently positioning it in a temporary construction zone marked by city cones she had ignored. And, in a twist of karma so fitting it felt scripted, a tow truck arrived, not from Karen's calls, but from the city itself. Her car, partially blocking the crew's access and violating the reconstruction order, was tagged for immediate removal. The driver checked the paperwork, confirmed the violation, and began attaching the hooks. Neighbors watched from their front porches, stunned at the poetic symmetry. The woman who summoned tow trucks on innocent families was now watching her own car disappear down the street, helpless to stop it. Even the construction crew seemed uncomfortable with the symbolism, but rules were rules, and this time Karen was on the receiving end of the consequences. The sound of the tow truck's engine faded into the distance, leaving silence behind. Karen stood alone, shaken not just by the financial burden, but by the realization that the power she once wielded so easily had finally collapsed in on itself. The neighborhood didn't celebrate. They simply watched, absorbing the full circle of events that had returned balance to their once disturbed street. Karen's era of control was finally over. Chapter 6. The Neighborhood Restored. With Karen's driveway reconstruction complete and her influence gone, the neighborhood gradually returned to the peaceful routine it once enjoyed. Cars stayed parked without fear. Children played near the sidewalks again. Delivery drivers stopped avoiding the area.
The tension that had once clung to every corner of the street dissolved into a calm that felt almost
It
brand
really
new.
is a beautiful evening, isn't it?
Karen
Absolutely.
became a
Perfect for a
quiet
walk.
I couldn't
presence,
agree more.
rarely
Let's make it a
leaving her
regular
house
thing.
except when necessary. She no longer filed complaints, monitored cars, or involved herself in others' business. Whether she had learned her lesson or simply feared further consequences didn't matter. The result was the same. The community could finally breathe again. The neighbors didn't gloat, nor did they attempt to reignite old conflicts. They simply appreciated the harmony they had reclaimed. They greeted each other with friendlier nods, shared small conversations, and felt a sense of unity strengthened by the ordeal they had survived together. What had once been a street filled with suspicion and anxiety had transformed into one defined by cooperation and
It
understanding.
really is a beautiful evening,
The
isn't it?
binder of
Absolutely.
evidence was
Perfect for a
tucked
walk.
away,
I couldn't
no
agree
longer
more.
needed.
Let's make it a regular
The
thing.
tow trucks were a memory, and Karen's driveway, rebuilt properly, legally, and at great cost, served as a subtle reminder of the consequences of misused authority. In the end, the neighborhood didn't need revenge. They simply needed accountability, and they achieved it not through spite, but through collective resolve. Their story became a quiet legend among nearby communities, the tale of a neighborhood that stood together, uncovered the truth, and watched karma arrive in the form of the very tow truck that had once terrorized them all. And with peace restored, life moved forward, calmer, wiser, and stronger than before.